Yuri Gubarevich, the chairman of the For Freedom movement, is now joining our broadcast. Yuri, good evening. We are glad to welcome you live on the Freedom TV channel.
Good evening.
Yuri, in fact, President Zelensky notes that things cannot go on like this, and Lukashenko must clearly assess and be fully aware of what is really happening at this moment. If back then, at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, he said, I didn't know those missiles had been here for a long time. Nothing was coordinated with me. But now, as President Zelensky again pointed out, Belarus is fully aware of what is happening on its territory. And now you can't say, as was done at the start of the full-scale war, it wasn't me, and this isn't my house. Now, the house is absolutely known for sure. Whose house it is? Is Lukashenko aware of this? What do you think?
Lukashenko understood perfectly well what was happening from the very first days of the full-scale invasion since 2022. Indeed, what has changed in the official attitude of Kiev toward Lukashenko is probably that the waiting period has already run its course. There was hope that he might somehow come to his senses, maybe for the sake of self-preservation would take a more neutral stance. But that's not the case. Unfortunately, he is deeply entangled in a subordinate relationship with the Kremlin. He literally carries out everything Vladimir Putin dictates to him, leaving himself only a small margin for maneuver. In terms of full complicity, this means the involvement of the Belarusian military. Nevertheless, in all other respects, this is not limited to just the events of the first months of the war, when even before August 2022, missiles continued to be launched from Belarusian territory. Was half a year really not enough time to understand what was happening right under his nose? This also includes the consequences of assisting Russian troops, providing medical treatment, training grounds, and various types of weaponry which were supplied before and continue to be supplied now, as well as the use of Russian Federation territory for waging war against Ukraine. It's any other kind of assistance as well. We can talk about ways to circumvent sanctions, the supply of sanctioned goods, where the official Belarusian regime also sees its own benefit. Here, Lukashenko is driven by several factors, probably. It's not just fear of Putin. It's a subordinate position and also the opportunity to make money. It doesn't matter that this money is being made at the cost of the blood of citizens from a country neighboring Belarus.
Yuri, so what about this point then? Well, look, really, the official Minsk, there's no other way to put it, has gotten itself completely entangled, right? And all these recent relays that have actually allowed the Shaheds to attack, recently both the Kyiv region and also Volyn have been targeted. So, in other words, there is already more than enough evidence. And the story with Oreshnik has basically become a byword for how, in fact, official Minsk treats both neighboring Ukraine and, for that matter, the European Union. What do you think? Will Belarus really become a separate subject for sanctions? And in fact, will this sanction strike be proportionate to everything that has already been done?
What is happening also primarily shows how the Lukashenko regime treats its own citizens, because the deployment of Oreshnik, and earlier there were talks about nuclear weapons, really puts Belarus among legitimate targets, as President Zelensky said, primarily for NATO countries. And he cannot fail to understand that this could significantly cause serious problems. That is indeed the case. But what he is doing for his own survival. And of course, it's hard to expect that anything in his behavior will change, because there are other examples as well that demonstrate complete complicity. The same goes for the removal of Ukrainian children and their subsequent ideological re-education under this regime. Lukashenko is an accomplice of Vladimir Putin. Yes, he will have to bear responsibility. And when we talk about tightening sanctions, of course, maybe for the regime itself, Ukrainian sanctions do not pose such a great threat to Lukashenko specifically. It's more like full-scale trade relations have practically ceased since 2022. The personal sanctions imposed by Western countries against Lukashenko and his officials are primarily related to the movement or storage of funds in foreign banks. But most likely, Lukashenko does not keep them either in the territory of the European Union or in Ukraine. Perhaps this serves as the very first, yet undeniably critical and foundational political signal, indicating that Alexander Lukashenko can no longer operate under the assumption that his controversial actions will continue to go completely unnoticed or remain entirely unpunished by the international community in the years to come. That Ukraine stands in solidarity here with other democratic countries, many of which impose significant sanctions precisely for the regime's complicity, Lukashenko's complicity in the war against Ukraine.
Well, then, I suppose I'll put my question this way. In your opinion, will this threat of comprehensive sanctions against both Lukashenko himself and his inner circle eventually lead to a change in the official position of Minsk? Well, considering that by and large, if we're talking about the same Oreshnik, then it's entirely and completely so. The system has not yet been delivered to Belarusian territory, only certain components have been sent so far. But in fact, a question arises. Now the question is, will Moscow ask for permission to deliver the rest, or will it just go ahead? And really, why would they even bother to ask Mr. Lukashenko for his opinion? No one is actually interested in his opinion, since in Moscow, what I mean is, after they've already taken the first step, in essence, they've basically started the annexation of Belarus. There's really no other way to call it. And then there are these upcoming large-scale exercises that Moscow and Minsk have planned. The last time such large-scale exercises took place 4 years ago, they ended in a full-scale war. There were exercises after that, but they were smaller in scale. And this is also, to a certain extent, a threat both to Ukraine and to the European Union and to the European continent as a whole. So accordingly, the pressure on Belarus will be increased. What actions will Minsk take in this regard? What do you think about this?
It's hard to say whether the introduction of full-scale sanctions will lead to a change in the policy of the Lukashenko regime in the near future, but as we can see, yes, indeed, sanctions from EU countries, at least as they were introduced, they continue to be imposed regularly. These are joint packages, and Belarus is included in the same packages that they are applied to Russia as well, but over these 4 years, there have been no significant changes in Lukashenko's behavior, although he does acknowledge the existence of problems. Literally, in the first months of this year, he held a series of meetings with his officials responsible for the economic sector, gave them a dressing down, and figures were cited showing a significant decline in the economy. Of course, Lukashenko will look for someone to blame everywhere except himself, even though he is the root cause of these problems. But the fact that this is now being discussed publicly shows that it is indeed a major problem that concerns Lukashenko's regime. His only way out is the possibility of survival with the support of the Russian Federation, as well as attempts to trade with countries of the so-called Far Arc, especially with those countries that are not too picky. This concerns the war in Ukraine, for which business comes first. There is a certain margin of safety for the regime here, but this margin is running out. That is why the issue of consistency in sanctions policy is very important. If on the part of the US we see attempts at negotiations and the lifting of some sanctions, although perhaps they do not bring results, this lifting of significant such relief for the regime, for example, sanctions against the national airline, permission to fly to the US, well, since it didn't fly there before, it probably won't fly there now either. But this already creates a certain room for maneuver. And the lobbyists for Lukashenko, including some who, let's say, publicly position themselves as opponents, but they talk about lifting European sanctions supposedly in exchange for the release of political prisoners. The huge problem here is that for Lukashenko, political prisoners are an inexhaustible source of resources. And if he releases several dozen or even 100 of his opponents, then literally within the same months, new ones take their place. New citizens of Belarus, and they receive significant prison sentences. That's why Lukashenko will keep maneuvering, he'll keep twisting and turning. But the clear signal that has recently come from Ukraine indicates that the room for maneuver will be quite narrow, and he will have to take responsibility for his actions.
Because indeed it constitutes a serious criminal offense. This is completely and undeniably evident. Every single one of these actions, and whether there is what is called evidence, the only thing missing is the legal component, so that essentially punishment would follow the crime in this situation. If we are really talking about the future that awaits the Republic of Belarus, it's interesting to consider how much the resilience of Belarusian citizens still remains. How much longer can they endure all of this? Well, considering that, yes, recently things have already started to... This whole story with the call-up of reservists for maneuvers, an emergency check of mobilization readiness, that's what they called it. And essentially people were literally sent straight to field camps on the very same day in order to test this readiness. People were dissatisfied, but essentially this will lead to people eventually taking to the streets again sooner or later. and demanded changes in their country in order to thereby change their own future. By the way, speaking of the Belarusian future, in one of his recent interviews, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, said that if Ukraine and Belarus were in the European Union, that would be a good thing. And what do you think about that?
Yes, indeed, it is worth supporting President Zelensky's position. In his interview, he clearly distinguished between the Lukashenko regime and Belarusian society, the Belarusian people. This is a very positive signal for the citizens of our country, because the majority still do not support Alexander Lukashenko's actions, they still disagree with them. But if we talk about the protests you mentioned at the beginning of your question, then you could probably draw a simple analogy here. If citizens are on a de facto occupied territory, you can put it that way, whether it's external Kremlin occupation or internal occupation by the Lukashenko regime, where the security apparatus has unlimited means to suppress any protests. Let me remind you, Lukashenko was shooting protesters even after the 2020 elections, and now their hands are completely untied. Yes, people understand that going out to protest with bare hands while under an occupation regime carries direct consequences not only for their freedom, but often for their lives as well. But that doesn't mean there is a sense of resignation in this situation, that there is some kind of progress about. Despite the efforts of Belarusian or Russian propaganda, people's opinions have not changed. They see the root of the problems, and they are worried about their future. And in the event that the regime makes yet another mistake, which could lead to mass unrest and people taking to the streets when there is truly nothing left to lose, understanding that you go out unarmed but could be shot, protests may return to Belarus. And this will be much more, let's put it this way, not such a peaceful ending. They will be like they were in 2020.
Yuri, but really, you say if the regime makes mistakes, but will the regime actually make these mistakes? What does your intuition tell you? For some reason, unfortunately, I feel that yes, it will. After all, strictly speaking, even, for example, the planned exercises, they can be cancelled, I mean the joint ones with the Russians, even at the very last moment. Will Mr. Lukashenko try to do something to change his own future, among other things? He is hardly interested in the future of the country. Not in a global sense, but certainly his own personal future.
Naturally, first and foremost, he thinks exclusively about his own future, his own security, and his own survival, which guarantees him staying in power, his position in our state. And he is doing everything possible to achieve this. Let's recall his recent attempts to improve relations with the Americans, even agreeing to join the Council of Peace initiated by Donald Trump. Lukashenko received an invitation but was unable to go. And here again we see the factor of Russia, which does not want to lengthen the leash it keeps on Alexander Lukashenko. If they see that he is getting carried away and immediately there is a pullback, I don't think it's just technical issues that prevented Lukashenko from somehow finding a transit route and flying to the United States, but it is also a direct reprimand from the Kremlin. And by the way, this is also happening in the public sphere. They have stated that they will not allow anyone to influence changes in the situation in Belarus. They talked about some possible provocations being prepared by Western countries or those opposition leaders who were forced to leave the country. But first and foremost, this was also a signal to Lukashenko himself that the Kremlin will not tolerate any changes in the current situation. And unfortunately, as long as it has the resources for such influence, in reality, it is impossible to expect that these changes could happen peacefully, but Lukashenko has made mistakes before. And one of the most serious mistakes would be the direct involvement of Belarus in the war, sending Belarusian citizens, military personnel to the theater of military operations, the first mass deaths, the loss of lives, the exchange of missile strikes. But he is probably in a situation where society is absolutely disloyal to the dictator. This will not guarantee him safety, even despite the bloated security apparatus, where the very same people living in Belarus who are unlikely to trade the lives and health of their families for supporting the dictator. That is, a coup could happen here, and this is what Alexander Lukashenko is afraid of.